Hello, and thank you to everybody for joining us today in this webinar. The webinar, as you can see from the slide, Unpaid Care Work and Covid-19, a missed opportunity to recognise, value and take action. We've got a wonderful lineup of speakers for the event, and I'd like to take the opportunity right at the beginning to extend my thanks, and the thanks on behalf of Shirin as well, to those. The webinar is hosted by two research centres, one in the University of York and one in the University of Warwick. I'm representing the IGDC, the Interdisciplinary Global Development Centre at the University of York. My name's Jean Grogel and I'm one of the directors of the centre. Just to give you a tiny background about the centre that I direct, we're an interdisciplinary research and teaching community based at York. We have over 100 members within the university, and our research is organised around three themes, which are social justice, global health, and sustainable environments. We also offer undergraduate programmes and postgraduate programmes in global development. There's a lot more information on the centre, which is on our website, which we will of course invite you to look at if you wish to, and on our Twitter. And of course, if you want to sign up for our newsletter, please indicate in the chat or let us know through email. Today's webinar is the 8th in our series on COVID-19. I'd like to now pass over to Shirin, who is Director of WICID of the Centre in Warwick, to say a few words about her centre.
Sorry, I forgot to unmute myself. So thank you, Jean. So let me very briefly, I'm Shirin Rai, and I'm a professor of international political economy at the Department of Politics and International Studies at the University of Warwick, which is where the Warwick Interdisciplinary Research Centre on International Development is based. And we call it WICID for short. Of course, it's too long otherwise. WICID's mission is to address urgent problems of social, political, and economic inequalities and change through our research and impact work. Interdisciplinary, critical, and robust analyses through collaborative knowledge building and exchange characterize WICID's approach and ensure impact in the four broad areas that we work in. Gender, which is, of course, today's focus, particularly work on unpaid care work, is an important part of what we do. Mobilities, peace, conflict, and justice, and global health. We also have the WICID's Methods Lab that ensures that we develop rigorous, innovative, and interdisciplinary methodologies to pursue our collaborative research and impact work. And these resources are open access for all working in the field of international development. So please visit our website if you'd like to access these. And just to also have a very brief plug for our inaugural lecture, annual lecture, where Mahmood Mamdani will speak on neither settler nor native, the making and unmaking of permanent minorities in May. So please look out for that and subscribe, as Jean said, to our newsletter so that we can keep you up to date with the latest news, events, and opportunities. Thank you.
Okay, before I pass over to the webinar proper, I just want to run through a few housekeeping points for everybody. First of all, recording. The session is being recorded, but only the video and the audio of the panelists. So attendees are muted, your video is off, and you won't be recorded. The only information that we will have from everybody else is the questions that you type in. And that takes me on to how to ask a question. So to ask a question, at the bottom of the screen, you've got the Q&A button, and please use that, not the chat, to ask questions. The panelists will answer questions submitted through the Q&A function, and questions can be voted on. So if you see somebody's already asked a question that represents the kind of question you'd like to raise, please give it a vote, and those questions that are most voted on will be the ones that are answered first. In terms of technical support, please use the chat function if you've got any technical issues you want to raise. We'll have somebody who will be able to answer you quite quickly on that issue. If you are somebody who tweets, I think the Twitter handles have been put in the chat already, so do please tweet if you've got comments, and if you're really enjoying the webinar, that would be great. Okay, I'm now going to pass over to the chairs of the webinar, who are Tallulah Lines and Jayanthi Lingham. So Tallulah is a PhD candidate in politics in the University of York, and she's also a research associate at IGDC, working on a project on the reproductive health of displaced women in Latin America. And Jayanthi is a postdoctoral researcher at WICID. Her interests are directly in the political economy of care work and in research at the intersection of conflict and development. And since 2019, she's been working on a project between Warwick and Monash on inclusive economies, enduring peace, the transformative role of social reproduction. So without any more ado, over to Jayanthi and to Tallulah.
Thank you so much, Jean and Shirin, for the introductions to the webinar and to the centres. And I just want to reiterate a very warm welcome to everybody, and thank you so much for joining us for this very important webinar. I'm chairing with Tallulah. I'll be chairing for the first half, and then I will pass over to her to manage what I'm sure will be a very rich discussion in the Q&A. As Jean mentioned, we're delighted really to be joined by our speakers who come from across the globe, from the Americas through to Asia. And I wondered if we could just kick off asking a little bit about where our audience is from. We have a poll just to ask where in the world you're from. And if you can join us, we just have if you can fill it in, and we just have a bit of an idea of who we're reaching. So we have where people are based, we have a heavy preponderance in Europe. 69% of you, of our audience of nearly 60, come from Europe. We also have a presence though across sub-Saharan Africa, Central and East Asia, South Asia, and South and Southeast Asia, and North America. So we are, and Central and South America. So we're spanning most parts of the world, which is fantastic. And in terms of organizations, 65% of you come from academic institutions. Then we have 10% from international NGOs, and then 6% from government or public bodies. We also have some from the private sector, think tanks, and foundations. And then a mysterious 8% other, which I would love to know about, but perhaps I'll leave that to Tallulah to ask people in the Q&A. So we have a really broad audience, and as I said, it's great to see you all. The topic today is unpaid care work and COVID-19, a missed opportunity to recognise value and take action. And just to go back to the broader context, globally, 75% of unpaid care work is carried out by women and girls. And of course, this gendered burden of labour intersects with inequalities of race, class, and caste. Just to recall some specific numbers, unpaid care work accounts for a huge part of global economic activity. And I know, given the audience breakdown and where you all come from, these figures won't be new or surprising to you. In 2016, just to take an example, unpaid household service work alone in the UK was valued at £1.24 trillion, which is nearly 2/3 of the country's GDP. And yet at the same time, care work remains largely unvalued, unrecognised, and unsupported in society. And this past year with the COVID-19 pandemic has foregrounded what feminists and women's movements have been shouting about for decades, if not longer. That is the fundamental importance of care work for society and the economy. Yet at the same time, and this is what drives the focus of our webinar, pandemic policy responses have exposed and exacerbated the persistence of gender inequalities and revealed the inadequacy of existing support structures. And just today, actually, the EU's annual report on gender equality said that women have been disproportionately affected by the pandemic because they make up the vast majority of workers in the paid, albeit very underpaid, care sector. And the pandemic has also brought, they report, a rise in domestic violence against women. So we're, as I said, really honoured to be joined by speakers from across the globe to discuss these matters. And without further ado, I would like to introduce them to you. So our first speaker will be Dr. Rosemary Morgan. She's an assistant scientist at Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health in the Department of International Health, with a joint position in the School of Nursing. Dr. Morgan is Associate Chair in the Inclusion, Diversity, Anti-Racism and Equity for the International Health Department. Rosemary has expertise in gender analysis and intersectionality. She currently leads the Sex and Gender Analysis Core for the NIH-funded Sex and Age Differences and Immunity to Influenza Center. She's the co-primary investigator on a project exploring the gendered effects of COVID-19 in Bangladesh, Kenya, Nigeria, DRC, and Brazil, as well as an advisor on a project exploring the gendered effects of COVID-19 in Canada, the UK, China, and Hong Kong. And she coordinates an international gender and COVID-19 working group. She also works as a gender equality and social inclusion advisor for the UK Partnerships for Health Systems programme. Our second speaker is Dr. Dia Datta, and Dia was until recently research lead at Oxfam India, and she was instrumental in producing the flagship report, the India Inequality Report, since 2019. And in 2019 and 2020, she undertook primary field research on unpaid care work for the 2 consecutive India Inequality Reports. Dia has been working on the issue of unpaid care work for more than a decade. She holds a PhD in sociology from JNU University in Delhi, and she got her MPhil degree in development studies at Oxford University, specializing in gender, South Asia's political economy, and aging. She's worked in program research and advocacy roles with various national and international organizations, including the United Nations, and she has domain expertise in gender, decentralized government, social transformations, aging, demography, women's political empowerment, violence against women, trade and investment, regional cooperation in South Asia. And she's currently an independent consultant in social development research, and she's working with the World Bank and Oxfam on women's economic empowerment, unpaid care work, and women's political movements. Our third speaker, Dr. Juliana Martinez Franzoni, is an associate professor at the University of Costa Rica in the Institute of Social Research, School of Political Science, and Center of Political Research and Studies. Juliana researches comparative welfare systems in Latin America, and her research focuses on welfare regimes, social policy, and inequality in Latin America. She also serves as co-editor of the Z Crop Global Poverty Series and Social Policy's International Advisory Board member. She recently published a book on universal social policy, actors, ideas, and architectures in the Global South with Diego Sanchez and Cochea. And her new project looks at the state and paternity across Latin America. And our fourth, and certainly not least speaker, is Professor Ruth Pearson, who is an emeritus professor of development studies at the University of Leeds and a self-described feminist economist and international development consultant. Professor Pearson has been with the University of Leeds since 2000 after establishing the Gender Analysis and Development programs at UEA, where she was MA Director in Development Studies for 10 years and holding the chair in Women and Development at the Institute for Social Sciences in The Hague. Professor Pearson's research has been focused on analysing globalisation from a gender perspective, examining changes in the employment of women workers internationally, reflecting the increased complexities of global production systems, and the ways in which work on migration, care, and reproduction have enhanced the understanding of the gendered nature of globalization. Recently, her research has expanded geographically from a focus on Latin America to include the Thai-Burmese border and the South Asian diaspora in the UK. Ruth is also involved with a number of international, bilateral, and national development agencies and NGOs. So those are our four illustrious speakers. Each of them is going to talk for 10 minutes. I will then hand over to my co-chair Tallulah, who will chair. That will include 15 minutes for you to ask your questions and 15 minutes or so for the speakers to then respond. So I'm going to hand over to our first speaker, who is Dr. Rosemary Morgan. And Dr. Morgan is going to speak on the topic of how are different groups of women and girls experiencing the demands and impacts of unpaid care work during COVID-19, and looking at an intersectional lens and how that can be mobilized.
Great, thank you, Jayanthi, and thanks for having me here today. As she mentioned, I'll be taking an intersectional lens to our topic today about unpaid care work and COVID-19. The next slide, please. So this was mentioned in my introduction, but I just wanted to highlight the larger project I'm currently involved in, which is looking to understand and mitigate real-time differential gendered effects of the COVID-19 outbreak across 9 countries. And a lot of what I'll be talking about today and some of the research I'll be presenting today is from this particular project. Next slide, please. So I'm sure many of you have heard this before and seen these headlines before. The fact that, COVID-19 is exposing our fault lines. Basically, what this means is that the COVID-19 outbreak is exacerbating existing inequalities. So in existing gender inequalities related, in relation to COVID, by increasing women's economic and social insecurity, unpaid care work, which is what we're talking about today, domestic violence, while cutting women off from social and institutional support. But as I'll talk about as I move on, it is important to take an intersectional lens to this, as not all women and not all men and not all gender minorities had the same experiences. Next slide, please. So what did it look like pre-COVID? So what this graph shows is the proportion of women being part of both paid and unpaid care work compared to men. And no country in the world has achieved an equal share of unpaid care work. You can see the disproportionate percentages here. And across all regions and countries, women do tend to do more unpaid care work than men across the life course. So when they're younger, middle-aged, and older. And in terms of volume, women perform on average 3/4, or that's around 76% of the total amount of unpaid care work. And that's a staggering number. Time-wise, they dedicate an average of 3.2 times more hours to unpaid care work than men, which amounts to about 201 working days for women compared to 63 working days for men with no remuneration. Next slide, please. But as I mentioned, we have to look at the inequality within the inequality. So the disparities in the gender division of unpaid care work result from deeply rooted inequalities based on such factors as income, education, age, race, ethnicity, and residence. So if I just going to highlight a few of these, notably people in rural residences. So if you live in a rural residence, it tends to increase the demand for unpaid care work among both women and girls, which can be, especially in low and middle income country contexts, more time consuming than urban areas due to poor access to services and infrastructure such as water and electricity, as well as labor saving equipment and processed food. And women and girls living in low income countries and rural areas and low education and income tend to provide a disproportionate share of unpaid care work compared to those in urban areas with higher education, higher income, for example. And the level of education is an interesting one because it affects time spent on unpaid care work but with opposing effects for women versus men. So while more educated women tend to dedicate less time to unpaid care and domestic work, while the higher the men's education and the more time he spends on unpaid care work. So we see an inverse relationship there. And gender gaps persist among different races and ethnicities. In the US, where I'm currently based, women spend more time on unpaid housework and care-related tasks than their male partners, with the largest differences found in Hispanic and Asian couples. And the race-based unpaid care gaps that we are seeing can really be explained by the fact that racial and ethnic minorities are more likely to live in poverty, in larger families with multiple generations, with less access to childcare and health services. And this results from entrenched, multifaceted socioeconomic inequalities linked to systemic racism. Next slide, please. This here is just a slide to highlight that point, and just looking at the average hours per day spent on unpaid care work by gender and race and ethnicity. So comparing white, Black, Asian, Hispanic, and multiracial. And as you can see there, that the women are in the green, which is high across the board, where if you look at Hispanic, Asian groups, we see higher levels of unpaid care work if this is in the United States. Next slide, please. But what has COVID-19 done to this? I mentioned it's exposed the fault lines, it's exposed the existing inequalities, so it's really amplified the impacts of unpaid care work. This is due to the reduced care supply, both as we're seeing in the formal care facilities, but also due to informal care. People aren't able to rely on grandparents as much. And many parents are having to work from home and juggle taking care of kids and children. And much of this additional workload has fallen on women. And what we are seeing is the care is being assumed predominantly by women during the pandemic. Next slide, please. So here is just a graph showing, this is in the, showing the hours spent by men and women on childcare and homeschooling in a workday during the COVID, both comparing US, UK, and Germany. And as you can see, women are spending disproportionate amounts across the board. Next slide, please. But again, what happens if we take an intersectional lens to this? So what this news article is showing is that on the front lines, both at work and at home, the disproportionate economic effects of the COVID pandemic are on women of color. And there's a really strong link between the economic impacts and the impacts of unpaid care work. So if women are having to go part-time, are losing their jobs, are doing more care at home because of COVID, this has direct impacts on their economic security, for example. Next slide, please. So just to highlight a few key groups, one survey in the US showed unpaid care and domestic work demands increased more sharply for those that are identified as Black or African American, Hispanic, or Latino compared to white respondents. Among the hardest hit are lone parents or single parents who are facing triple challenges combining all of these things I was talking about. And this impact is most acute on lone mothers who substantially outnumber lone fathers. Next slide, please. Just wanted to highlight just a few quotes from our Gender and COVID-19 project. So my colleague, Dr. Julia Smith, is leading the Canadian portion of this study, and she did some interviews with women and mothers to find out what really the impact is like. So, and these key informant interviews were conducted in British Columbia between March and July 2020. Next slide. This quote here is from a single mother. She says, "I go to the cashier who was like, 'Why are you taking your kid to get groceries?' And I was just, I don't know where to put him. Like, I can't leave him alone. I feel like I'm being a very bad mom." So what we're seeing is single mothers don't have the support network as they did before. And that is kind of thinking about intersections and thinking about who makes up the demographics of single mothers is important. Next slide, please. This quote is from a newcomer mother. So this would be someone who's recently immigrated to Canada. So my daughter asked me, I want to order this book. She finds it online, and I explained to her I didn't have money to buy it. Before COVID, we could go to the library, and from the library in the first month, I think everywhere is closed. And she told me I read some of them twice or 3 times. It's boring. I need more books. So this is having impacts. This is a newcomer mother from a lower socioeconomic background, thinking about what is the actual immediate impacts on these crises and care. Next slide, please. This again is from a single mother who says, I think the recognition of these informal support networks that we rely on heavily. So for example, mothers groups, nannies, informal nannies, the neighborhood grandma that usually supports you, we're all cut off from this. So again, highlighting what was there existing to support women during this is gone. Next slide, please. And I just wanted to end on like the point of our talk today. Is this a missed opportunity? Next slide, please. Here is, a quote from Jessica Valente, and the point I wanted to touch upon is what is being focused upon in the media. So it's focused on like more women are doing unpaid pair work, more women are doing homeschooling. But if you can see in the middle here, it's not that husbands who simply refuse to do their fair share of parenting, or the government who could help but didn't. So where is the focus of our attention right now? Where the focus is on women and the increased care work, but really should we be flipping that switch, and using this as an opportunity to try to transform the social norms? And next slide, please. And with that, I will say thank you.
Thank you so much, Rosemary, for a really rich and thought-provoking presentation. I'm going to hand over to our next speaker, Dia Datta, and Dia is going to talk to us about how we understand the increase in unpaid care work for women and girls during the pandemic in relation to what the UN has reported as a shadow pandemic of an increase in domestic violence.
Thank you, Jayanthi, and thank you to everyone. Next slide, please. So I'm going to begin with reference to a study I conducted in 2019 and was published in 2020, where we looked at the intersection between violence against women and girls and the high burden of unpaid care work, and conceptually try and see how these two kind of link up, because we did a earlier study where we did a survey in 2019, and that actually showed that there are very high levels of acceptance of violence against women for non or poor performance of unpaid care work. So I'm going to start with that and then come down to actually talking about how COVID-19 has really exacerbated the problem, and it was totally a missed opportunity from the public policy, public health point of view, in terms of services to women, etc. So in this slide is what I'm conceptually trying to explain, which is that if you look at the dark green boxes, those are the direct causes of violence against women. And these are actually structural gender inequality, discrimination, elements in a woman's life. So for example, unequal power relations, gender norms and beliefs, male control over decision-making and resources, dominant ideals of manhood and womanhood, the concept of the breadwinner man and the caregiving woman, structural inequalities, etc. So these are the actual direct causes of violence in women's life. But because these exist, things such as non or poor performance of unpaid care work, like mistakes in household work or unappetizing food or delay in cooking or cleaning, are actually triggers that lead to violence. So in a sense that if you do not address the structural causes of violence in women's lives and the inequalities that remain in gender relations, you will not be able to address the issues that actually trigger violence, which are non or poor performance of unpaid care work. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm not, for interests of time, I'm not going into the methodology of the study that we conducted. If we have time and people are interested, I'll be happy to share that. The home is one of the most contested spaces when it comes to gender relations. It is the breeding ground of gender inequality between the breadwinner man and the woman who is considered as the homemaker. What makes it unequal is that because the work that women do, often backbreaking and time-consuming, is not valued as productive formal labor that brings in income, their needs and rights go unnoticed. But how does it come into being? It happens through the practice of social norms, a common understanding of appropriate conduct by individuals or a group of individuals. Social norms can not only underpin human behavior, but keep it in check via praise and acceptance and penalties such as censure to violence. Social norms can be deeply gendered and patriarchal, where the man is viewed as the provider of the family and the woman as the caregiver subordinate. The burden of care work is so immense that it has negatively impacted their participation in the workforce, circumscribed their pursuit of education, and discourages them from taking care of their health. In short, because of high burden of unpaid care work, women, especially poor women, are extremely time poor. Next slide, please. The study that we conducted in 2019 also found that there are interlinkages between unpaid care work and violence against women. And the first slide that I showed you kind of tries to interlinkage. Women's duty towards the household and the family is their prime responsibility and has deep social currency. So any mistake made by the woman within this context can be seen as deserving of punishment through violence by men and women. And women are judged for the performance of house and care work, and non or poor performance of it can be a trigger for violence. They can be humiliated, verbally and physically abused. Next slide, please. So I did mention about the household care survey that we conducted in 2019. I mean, it was published in 2019, conducted in 2018. And you will see here that there's very high acceptance of violence against women for non or poor performance of unpaid care work. And what is interesting is that this was a 1,000 household survey that was conducted, of which 70% were women. So actually the acceptance levels of violence against women is highest amongst women themselves. Next slide, please. So now I want to talk a little bit about violence against women as the shadow pandemic. So violence against women and girls has emerged as a major societal evil during the pandemic and ensuing lockdowns worldwide. So, I mean, what happened was that women got locked in with their perpetrators of violence. They had no access to services. They had no access to any kind of recourse, and they were not able to step out of the home. So things were really bad. Data has just begun to emerge across the world, which shows that the incidences of violence have increased exponentially during the pandemic. India is no exception to this. As you will see in this data that there was a 79% increase in cases of domestic violence in 2020 from 2019. The months from April to June actually saw quite a large number of cases of violence being reported. There were spikes in helpline calls, a 20% increase in calls received by the National Commission of Women, which is the government body which is responsible for taking care of women's issues. And I mean, the number of complaints of domestic violence in 2020 made by women over a 68-day period was highest in the last 10 years. So clearly, I mean, the pandemic kind of precipitated and exacerbated the issue of violence against women and girls to a massive proportion. And next slide, please. Sorry, if you can just go back to the previous slide, I just want to speak a little bit more. So in the initial days of the lockdown, all women support services and helplines in India were shut down. It was only after the civil society activists and women's rights defenders started putting pressure on the government to open up women's support centers and helplines that they sent as essential services did the government heed to the demand. So, which actually is a major revelation that women's support centers and helpline numbers should actually be considered as essential services and not something that gets shut down during an emergency situation. While the women helpline numbers were flooded with distress calls after they were opened up, many women were trapped in with perpetrators of violence and could not access these services. Some who did complain did not receive adequate support from the government support services like the police or the legal and the paralegal centers, and in turn faced heightened violence. Some innovative solutions were made available. For example, in the northern state of Jammu and Kashmir, designated informal safe spaces for women such as grocery stores and pharmacies were created where they could register their complaint without alerting their perpetrators. So overall, the situation of women was, especially poor marginalized women, was quite distressing. But there could be solutions which can be replicated in other places. And for example, the Jammu and Kashmir example that I shared. I would end here if we have time. Yeah, there's 1 minute. So could you just move to the next slide, please? Yeah, so I just wanted to give you a pictorial representation of the amount of work done by a woman within a 24-hour work cycle compared to a man. So what we did during the study was we asked women to list all the activities they do and all the activities that men do from the time they get up in the morning till the time they go to bed at night. And then we asked them to take out those activities which are purely for personal in nature, such as, like personal hygiene, bathing, etc. Now, if you see this, I mean, the left-hand side are the work that women do from morning till late at night, and the right-hand side are the work that men do from morning till they go to bed at night. So, I mean, it's pretty obvious that even in normal circumstances, women's unpaid care labor is highly overburdened than what men perform or even help in terms of helping women. Now, in COVID times, it became much worse because the children were also at home. You had to take care of the family. Sometimes, in many cases, extended families were also staying with you. Access to public services was also restricted, etc. So it was quite difficult for women. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dia, for that presentation. I'm now going to hand over to our third speaker, Dr. Juliana Martinez Franzoni, who's going to talk now about what kinds of social policies are needed from states or governments or others to support unpaid care workers, both in the long term and particularly during crises.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I will share with you some ideas we put together with Veena Siddharth in a paper we recently put together for a UN Women's expert meeting on care held in December. So I was asked to talk about what social policies, and I wanted to depart from the idea that we all share, I think, that the crisis really made it visible that care was sitting on very fragile or non-existent collective solutions, right? And this is particularly striking in regions such as Latin America, where labor informality can go up to 70% in countries like Bolivia, Guatemala, and Honduras pre-pandemic, where there is a persistent sexual division of labor and gender inequality, so that women do 7 of every 10 hours of unpaid domestic and care work. and where there is a significant role of race and ethnicity when it comes to access to resources, to very basic resources such as safe child delivery. So as the next slide shows, next slide, please. Yes. As a shock, right? The pandemic is analogous to an earthquake, to a tsunami, to a war. So the pandemic made it possible to envision the chance of making a U-turn, right? Borrowing from Nancy Folbrecht's great contribution to move from a low road of unpaid and precarious women's work to a high road of care work as decent work, including, of course, for domestic and migrant workers. So this is very, the more unequal a region is, the more important this becomes. Latin America's absence of universal care services generally coexists with low-paid and unprotected domestic care work, which makes up to 15% of women's employment, in sharp contrast with many other regions of the world. So, so this shock really made it possible to envision a change. Now, if we move to the next slide, please, what we see is that, of course, in terms of policy, the reorganization of care work touches on every single policy, from labor and social policy to productive economic, macroeconomic, fiscal policy. Care work has to do with everything the state does, right? Now, if we only look at social and labor policy, we can see, based on UN Women's and UNDP's tracker, that worldwide, only 8% of all measures put in place during 2020 had to do with care work. Only 8% of all the measures. So for all the clapping that we've done about care work, about nurses, and about essential workers, very little has changed as far as recognizing, valuing, and honoring in practical ways the work that these people, mostly women, do. So far, we've seen a lot of the low road of care work around. And as the next slide shows, you know, this reflects not only on the unpaid care work that's been done within the household, but also in the heavy reliance on community services, right? So on the one hand, the integration of community-based services into the public sector it can be very important to take care of very acute problems, and can be very effective in countries where people do not trust the state, or trust the state very little in terms of its being a friendly hand, having a redistributive role. Nonetheless, it can also become part of the low road approach to care work. Why? Because it comes hand in hand with very little payment, or with the notion of collaborator versus workers. This is work mostly done by women, unprotected, and in very precarious conditions. Just to mention ASHA workers in India, it's almost 1 million women receiving a very small payment by state governments to be the first call, the first line of defense for any health-related demands, right? And so usually when social policy relies on community services, it's basically relying on an army of unpaid or underpaid female labor. Next, please. So if care-friendly social policies are to occur, well, we badly need change, and regrettably, we are not seeing it. We've seen a window of opportunity in the conversation around fiscal packages and investment, you know, to face the crisis, as in the case of the US. And here we see a sharp global divide between the global North and the global South. So whereas we see a conversation about expansionary social policy in the global north, in most of the global south, at least in Latin America, that's clearly the case. We've entered austerity politics all the way. So even though public policies and state agencies were the first line of or the second line of defense after families and unpaid female labor to meet the pandemic, you know, the heavy need for public resources has driven the conversation towards old-fashioned austerity politics. And even though there is evidence that investing in care would expand the fiscal space if done while expanding formal employment for women, so even though we have evidence that investing in care can actually have a very positive macroeconomic effect, that's not the narrative. The narrative is basically to cut back on everything, including the very little progress that was made in Latin America during the previous 15 years around paid maternity leave for informal workers, for instance, around early child education and care, and around the notion that there was such a thing as a care sector that the state needed to formalize in interaction with pension systems, with education systems, with healthcare systems. If there is any chance to undo this worrisome trend, then by which women have basically been erased from policy. Women, gender, and care work have been basically erased, even in cash transfers that were rapidly deployed during 2020. If this is going to be changed, then we need to think very badly about the political economy that's needed to do this. It's not only the what social policies, but the how of the social policies that we need. Ideally, of course, we would need to have care mainstreamed, right, across policy functions and sectors, including very clearly the regulation of social private services. You know, we have plenty of examples of social services that benefited from the pandemic for profit rather than for the sake of recipients. And we have plenty of examples of this, for example, in the US, some examples in Canada as well. So it's not only a problem that we have in the global south. The pandemic has shown the need to improve the regulation that the states have of how care is provided in the private sector. So there's a lot to be done, but to wrap things up, if I were to prioritize, I would say that we shouldn't leave this pandemic without creating consensus around the notion that care has to be part of social protection floors, whether we call them basic social protection floors, or, regardless of how basic these protection floors are, we need to make care part of social protection, and that can offer an entry point to change this situation. But of course, this requires that policy reach not only the most vulnerable women and women under the poverty line, but also the middle class, the middle low class. We need to create broader coalitions if we're going to make some progress. So hopefully in the Q&A we can explore more, more ideas around the political economy of change that can bring about the social policy that we need to make, to place care at the center of it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Juliana. It's very energizing to be thinking about the policies that are needed, and it will certainly be good to hear, especially, but not only, from the policymakers who are in our audience. I'm going to hand over now to our fourth and final speaker, Professor Ruth Pearson, who's going to talk about the importance of unpaid work globally and how COVID-19 might open up the possibility of having care on the development policy agenda. Thank you, Ruth.
Thank you. Actually, what I want to say, very much follows from what previous speakers have said about what COVID has demonstrated about the centrality of care in economies across the world. And I think the thing that I would like to emphasize is that word economy, not just about social policy, but about economic policies. And I think that gives us the opportunity to think about policy approaches which relate to the crises that we have been going through. So my first point, which I think others have made, is that COVID-19 has shown the centrality of reproductive work for the functioning of the economy as well as society. The extent and the importance of unpaid work in the household, the true nature of essential services and activities in the paid economy. And I think Sarah Savana's work on how the nature of essential depends on the context and on the political economy of the country is also very important. Not all countries list the same services as essential. But the other point, I think, which Rosemary and Juliana have also illustrated, is the ways in which unpaid work, particularly but not only care work, is intensified or facilitated by access to complementary services from the market and the community. So I want to focus a bit on that complementarity. And actually what I'm going to be talking about is recent work in the UK on the elder care sector, which I think has it has relevant for more international discussion. And one of the things I think that we could think about is that what COVID-19 has shown is, in the words of the old song, you don't know what you've got till it's gone. And I think for a lot of people's experience, the being cut off from the kind of services that make life possible has been a very devastating experience. And I also looked at the UNDP, UN Women's Global Gender Responsive Tracker, which, as Juliana says, indicates that only 8% of the total numbers of gender sensitive measures were to do with unpaid care work. Now, I think what is considered to be a gender sensitive measure is also quite interesting, because these included childcare and elder care aimed services. But a lot of them were, as has been said, about income support, social protection, support to paid workers in the care sectors, minimal support, but support to care workers in the paid sectors, but very little exploration of how unpaid work can be supported by public policy beyond support to individual households and carers. And I think that I want to focus a bit on that context. Now, as I've said, COVID-19 was a crisis. And in my research experience, I mean, it was very like the crisis imposed by structural adjustment, or the crisis that I looked at in Cuba when the Soviet subsidies were withdrawn very rapidly. And so that changed the whole, what I call the whole reproductive bargain, the whole division of responsibility for the reproduction of people, that is the daily reproduction and the generational reproduction, but also the reproduction of society, the reproduction of the way society functions. That was brought much more in Cuba into the household from, and a lot of services that were available to households from government and from the community were withdrawn. And in a way, that's what's happened in COVID-19, that things people could rely on that may have made their life possible And as we've heard, that's often women who are responsible for unpaid work. That was cut off by the health protective measures of lockdown and the shutting down of key reproductive services in the public sphere. And that has had hidden but important effects for people involved. And it has been rather, I think, neglected in terms of the public policy discussion. And so the research that we've been doing with the Women's Budget Group in the UK indicates that this has become a crisis in terms of unpaid care work. Unpaid care work, as we know, is a feature of all societies. But in situations where access to services has been cut down, that has had a very negative effect both on carers and on those who receive cares. Now, just in the since March 2020, in the UK, we calculate that the number of unpaid carers, people who define themselves in that role within families, has increased by an estimated 4.5 million people, of whom 58% of them are women. I think it's important to say that in lots of situations, men as well as women do unpaid care work, particularly of older people, and particularly when women who are particularly susceptible to dementia in older age, there are a lot of men caring for them. But nevertheless, the majority of carers are women. And 3 million of these additional 4.5 million home carers were juggling paid work and care. And I think one of the things I want to emphasize is that obviously these activities are linked and people do both at the same time. And the research indicates that 70% of family carers reported that caring had had a negative impact on their physical and mental health, that they found it difficult to access health advice or key services during the pandemic. And also services that were available, like domiciliary carers, many were so concerned about the vulnerability of the people they were caring for that they refused domiciliary care workers coming into their house. So they took on additional burdens, even if that mitigation was available. And they particularly missed the community-based services, respite care, day centres, etc., so that their hours of care work increased phenomenally, and that family carers of working age suffered most. And many faced a range of financial hardships, including having to use food banks, which were emergency food supplies, and got into debt. And I think that the discussion of the invisibility of care has really focused, I think, on labour market and income issues, and not on the way that, in Shireen's terms, the way that individual family unpaid carers have been depleted in terms of their own well-being. And in the UK, this has been exacerbated, because although there is a benefit that carers can get, carers allowance, it's only at the level of 13% of the average weekly wage. And also, many low-paid workers don't meet the income threshold to access carers allowance. So although, you know, people say in developed countries there's a lot more financial support and safety nets, this is true, but it's minimal and it's being eroded. And at the same time, the age in which women in the UK receive the state pension, and indeed men, has risen, leaving many older carers in poverty and ill health. And I think also the way in which we think of unpaid care work in terms of elder care is that it's always carried out behind closed doors within a family setting. And in fact, what we've learned in the UK from the crisis in residential care home, where there have been tens of thousands of deaths, all kinds of problems about shortages of PPE and so on, exposure of care workers to infection. Also, what has been neglected was before the pandemic, family visitors carried out a lot of actual care work, even within the residential care setting, a lot of feeding, a lot of physical support as well as, and practical support as well as emotional support. So when that has been denied for residents in care homes, as well as the emotional connections with their relatives, it's accelerated their decline and mortality. So I think in terms of the discussion of what it means in terms of unpaid care, we have to have a much broader conceptualization. Now, you can see parallel things within childcare, both for preschool children and for school-aged children. And the situation in the UK is that because of neoliberal policies and preschool provision, nursery sector provision is extremely unstable. It's been privatized, even though there's there's some public funding for working women. A lot of these centers have gone out of business because they're not viable in the current situation. There are whole areas where there are no there's no available childcare, and many women who are parents of small children have to work in order to support the family, and they are essential workers, so they have to work face to face. We've seen, and there are no complementary services like play parks, indoor play centers, and so on have been shut. So again, they're locked in without community facilities. Now, I think I have to move on.
Yes, sorry to
yeah, okay. So let me just talk about policy implications, because I think that what we've always said in feminist economics analysis is that unpaid work needs to be recognized, reduced, and redistributed, the 3 R's. And I think the redistribution bit is important because it's not just about redistribution between women and men, but it is between the public and the public sphere and the private sphere. And I think we have to recognize also that money resources never take the whole cost of reproductive and care work. It's only the commodity cost, and actually the physical labor is done by individuals. So policy measures we could take, there's 2 things that I want to mention and then I'll stop. One is that I think, when we think about whatever follows the SDGs, rather than focus on gender equality measures, which of course are important, I think a target of the percentage of GDP in services that support and enable women's reproductive work in the unpaid care economy would be a measure to explore. And that, in our view, reflects the need to invest in what we call the social infrastructure, the reproductive services, which have been highlighted in the COVID-19 pandemic. And that investment in the social fabric of our society is as important as the physical infrastructure, which tends to be the basis of most economic stimulus patterns. So the last thing I'm going to say is that we actually did a lot of research. We had a commission on a gender equal economy, and we have produced a report which is called Towards a Caring Economy, which sets out an economic plan to put care at the center of economic policy. And that, as Liana has said, investment in care in care services at proper salaries and working conditions is actually better, more stimulating for the economy than investment in construction, produces 2.7 more jobs, and these are green jobs rather than polluting jobs. So I think we have to see not this separation between economic and social policy, but an integration, and to argue for an economic strategy that puts care in all its dimensions at the center of objective. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ruth. I'm sorry to stop you at that very interesting point. We just want to make sure we have enough time for the number of very interesting questions that are coming in. And I'd like to thank all of our speakers and hand over to Tallulah to take over for the Q&A, please.
Yeah, thank you. Just to echo what Jayanthi said, it's been a really interesting and fruitful discussion. If a little depressing at times to think about all the challenges that we've seen and what we still have ahead of us. So I certainly have plenty of questions, but I'll hand over to the audience. So we have a few questions for the panelists. So I'd like you just to, if the panelists just want to feel free to answer, these aren't specific questions for any of the speakers in particular. So the first question that we've had come in is, women have taken on more unpaid across the world during COVID. What about children? Have they been asked to take on more chores in and around the house? As in many parts of the world, schools have been shut for long periods of time. And so if so, is that mostly girls who've taken on extra unpaid care work?
I'll be happy to answer this one. So that is it is a good question, and there has been some research on this particular topic. One thing that's important to consider is the context here, based in high, middle, and low income countries, are going to be very different. And some of the research has shown that yes, children have taken on more of the chores, especially in high income country settings, like, you know, the cleaning and pet care, things like that. In low and middle income countries, you know, I think we're still seeing some data come out about this, and girls are taking up more care work. I think some of the issues is when parents lose their jobs as well, girls are often taking up care work and also work outside the home. And it's very much linked to girls returning back to school. So to me, that's almost, you know, the care work is a burden, but it's very much linked to abilities to participate in homeschooling at that time. So, you know, going on the computer, doing the Zoom, that studies are showing that girls have less time for that because they have more time, they're doing more care. But then also with all the implications, it's now estimated that 11 million girls will not return to school because of COVID-19, which is just all these things are kind of building on each other and impacting one another.
Thanks, Rosemary. I don't know if anybody else wants to come in to answer that question. Ruth?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I think that research does indicate that girls are taking on more of a burden. But I think also the context makes girls and boys vulnerable, so sometimes in different ways. And the fact that a lot of the schooling has been done online has made girls very vulnerable to online grooming. And, you know, there are all these kind of websites that they get involved in, which are sort of pre-porn websites. And I just think that there's been very little public discussion of the vulnerability of young people to the measures that have been taken. And also, you know, there's been a tsunami of mental health problems with young people. And actually, I think girls have a higher rate of self-harming, boys have a higher rate of suicide and things. So I think that there are gender differences, but I think that the reprivatization of social reproduction has had impacts on young people in different ways of both genders.
Thank you, Ruth. Dia, did you want to come in on that one as well?
Yeah, I just wanted to give a perspective from the Indian context, because there are studies which are coming out which are showing now that there are two things. One is that millions of girls who dropped out of school will probably never go back to school, and child marriage is going to increase exponentially in the coming few years. The other thing is about the whole digital divide, because a lot of children belong to very poor families, live in remote areas, and did not have access to either a smartphone or forget about a laptop, and could therefore not actually access education at all, because I mean, in India, the whole question of moving education to the digital space is a very middle to upper class kind of concept. And it's nothing, I mean, it completely loses out on the entire poor and vulnerable sections of the population. Thanks.
Thanks, Dia. We'll move on to the next question, which is coming from Veena. So this is more around policy. What are the most promising paths to reconstruct policies around care post-COVID? Evidence, public pressure and campaigning, or fiscal policy, for example?
May I?
Yeah.
Thank you, Veena, for your question. I think we can have a shared vision regarding the need for reorganization, redistribute, reward care work, right? But when it comes to roads, pathways to do it, of course, there is no one size fits all, right? And these pathways will be heavily content dependent, heavily dependent on the social policy regimes and the care diamonds, the combination of communities and states and families and labor markets that are in place. Even within Latin America, Uruguay, where I am originally from, has slightly over 20% of informal labor, right? Whereas in Guatemala, it's over 80. So of course, we'll have to, we need to address these variations, these deep variations that take place even within regions. I would say that at least like two different scenarios. One in which we can expect top-down change, because countries heavily need women, highly educated women to stay in the labor market. And so there is more chances that change can happen in a top-down fashion. I'm thinking about Uruguay, Costa Rica, but then there is most of the region where there is exclusionary social policy and economies can do without, women in the labor market. In fact, it's better if they are home, right? Because they are not putting pressure on the labor market and they are getting so much work done. So here, if we don't have like, bottom-up pressure, feminist organizing, social movements, making a strong case for change, we will not see it. And here, I would like to also add to a comment made by Jayanthi that in many of these countries, states are heavily repressive, and people and women do not trust governments. Take Guatemala, where so many indigenous children have been taken away over the years, with the excuse of testing whether they are malnourished. Of course, these women will not trust state governments, and there's where community-based services can become part of caring solutions. But even if that's the case, we need to think about making community services part of the high road to the reorganization of care work. And that needs public funding, even if it's going to be channeled through community-based organizations. So I think there is a lot of work that we need to do. Now, before the pandemic, Latin America needed at least 3.5% of GDP devoted to very basic social services on average. Imagine how much more we need now. So unless we have a serious fiscal conversation, and unless part of the elite is willing to make a contribution, even a tiny little contribution to expand the fiscal space to fund these services, it's unlikely that we will see change. So I don't think we need to be pessimistic. We need to be really strategic to bring care work into the mainstream of the conversations that are being taking place now as countries are discussing with the IMF, what's the next standby program will look like. So, we need a lot of international conversations around these priorities, and international organizations could be on the side of a smart reorganization of care work, or not.
Thanks, Juliana. So we have another couple of questions which are quite similar, so I'll ask these ones together. Zhang says that these are impressive studies and a pressing picture for women who are doing the care work at home every day. Zhang asks, how can policy support the unpaid care work and at the same time without infringing on privacies of individuals at home or families as a whole? And Dala asks or says, care work is usually shared disproportionately by family, state, market, and community. Usually women in the families have to take the heaviest care burden. So what instruments or mechanisms can distribute the care work more equally between the four sectors: family, state, market, and community?
Can I answer that then?
Sure, Ruth. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think these are very important questions, and also the issues that Juliana brought up in answer to the last question, that context is absolutely crucial. But I think that we're all in different kind of contexts in terms of this question. But what's become clear in the UK is, firstly, even though there is some publicly resourced care services, because of privatization and the way global financialization has seen the care sector as a growing and lucrative sector, these are delivered mainly by privately owned and sometimes internationally owned companies, which are profit oriented rather than service oriented. So that has to be tackled in our context. I think that there, certainly in the UK, and I think in other parts of Western Europe, there is a danger of state support for the care sector being actually state support for the privatized care economy. And I think that's a real danger. I think some of the solutions that are being proposed, like this so-called care commitment, where families would sign up and agree to take on care for elderly or disabled people in exchange for economic incentives, including the right to keep their private home and things, threaten to intensify existing gender divisions of labor and force women out of the labor market. And I think, for poorer women and those in minority groups, that is a real danger. But I think in general, and also we have the situation where, although local authority to some extent resources care services, they don't have any funding to do that, and there needs to be a redistribution of funds internally as well as internationally. But I think also a lot of the issue is that care, when we talk about care policy, it's focused on crisis care, not everyday care. And I think if we thought about it in terms of everyday care, if we thought about people, who need care across the life course in different ways, who need access to local services, who need to be able to have transport, who need to be able to live and to be, to have their full capacity as much as they can, then you wouldn't just get this sort of emergency care attitude, but you'd get a planning policy and an economic policy which was, aimed at well-being of people. I take the point about people, being very distrustful of the state, and I think that is true in many, many situations. And I think, therefore, the local partnerships and, as you say, bottom-up solutions, cooperative solutions based on the locality is what we have to argue for, but financed by real level of resources necessary. I mean, one thing that COVID has shown in certainly in the UK is this limit on fiscal space because of the need to not have budget deficits and not to increase public debt has been blown out of the water. And that, I think, provides us an opportunity to argue for an increased fiscal space. Of course, in Britain, we don't have fiscal space. We have what I would call fiscal gerrymandering, which is a whole other issue. But I think that there is an opportunity internationally and nationally to argue for a different vision of care, and for it to be a central part of economic strategy.
Thanks, Ruth. I'm just conscious of time. Okay, Rosemary, if you'd like to come in on that one, and then I have one more question from the audience to ask.
Sure, thanks. I think the point that Ruth made about the distinguishing between crisis care and everyday care is really important one. And then also like that we are in this opportunity, this place right now to the phrase build back better, right? To reimagine the ways in which we currently are doing things. And we have been doing a lot of work about how do we create a gender responsive pandemic plan, which actually does include the recovery phase. And I was thinking through what are some of the policies, these crisis policies that are going on right now, you know, in parental leave, providing care services, providing financial support. So income and utility support have been things that to show to directly and indirectly support care. But, you know, are these long-term solutions? And my question is, they don't actually change the underlying dynamics. I mean, it's really interesting. I saw a study recently about millennials that while millennial men are very all for gender equality, you know, that it very much applies to women working. It actually hasn't really come across to work in the home and the equal distribution of labor. So we're still seeing this disconnect, that there's still this norm change that's needed, that we really need to, I don't have a clear answer, because this is long-term, bottom-up, transformative change that needs to happen early in schools and in the family through example. And yes, policy can help support this, but it also needs to come from families.
Rosemary, I'm very conscious that we just have a few minutes left, but there is a question in the chat that a couple of people have liked, so I think there's some interest in it. So I'll pose it to the panel, but if you can just give your briefest answers, just so that we can finish time. Is a compensation scheme similar to those in environmental economics feasible for current unpaid carers?
I don't know the answer.
Okay. Is there anybody else that would like to come in?
Yeah, I don't know what the compensation.
Could you repeat the question? I didn't understand the question. Could you repeat it?
Yes. Is a compensation scheme similar to those in environmental economics feasible for current unpaid carers?
I would need to know what that compensation scheme is, and I don't know what it is.
We don't know.
Okay, well, maybe it's quite a specific issue then, and unfortunately, I'm not sure we're going to have time to be able to.
Because I don't know what the compensation scheme she or he is talking about is, but we definitely need to change the bargaining power within the household and in the interaction between households and labor markets, households and states. So to the former question that had to do with whether states may risk infringing in privacy and individual decision making, the point is that by default, states are all the time doing that, right? By default, shaping private preferences and private norms. We have plenty of evidence coming from the Scandinavian countries that show that in the 70s, when a lot of normative change was happening, there was a very hands-on state activating that, hand in hand with social movements, yes, but it's not as if norms change, you know, like just change. You know, we need action to change the norms. And it's often come from grassroots organizations. It's often come from state agencies or a combination of both, right? So I think it's very important that in each context, we identify where that source for change is coming from and potentiate that, right, from a policy perspective with the goal of changing women's bargaining power. If it's sanitation and not having women devote so many hours to carry water, that's going to have some effect on her bargaining power eventually, right? So if it's about improving running water, electricity, all of that helps to have, you know, a different conditions to change women's bargaining power, and then gender relations. So I see it as a menu with lots, or as a puzzle with a lot of pieces that need to come together, but in different order, depending on the context where we are standing or working in. Thank you for the invitation to this wonderful panel.
Brilliant, Juliana. Thank you so much for your contribution, and to the other panelists as well, Ruth, Dia, and Rosemary. Thank you so much. It's been a really interesting discussion. So we're going to have to wrap up, unfortunately. There were a couple of questions we couldn't get to in the Q&A. So I apologize for that. But this webinar will be, the recording of the webinar will be posted on the IGDC YouTube channel for anybody who's interested in going back and taking another look at what the panelists have discussed. There will also be a follow-up blog about what we've discussed today. And also, please, if you're interested in the next IGDC web, please have a look at our Twitter so you can see information about upcoming events there. So thank you again to the panelists. Thanks to Tara for pulling everything together, and Jayanthi for opening up the chairing today. Thanks, everybody.